right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Purple Nuna Podcast. I'm juror number 3, and I'm here with not only juror number 7, but I am also here with juror number 12. And for those who might be like, huh? Yes, our 25th episode has our first guest on it, David Blakeslee from
Woo!
Criterion Reflections podcast. Let's give it up for David.
Yay!
First guest. How are you doing, David?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I live, and I am absolutely delighted to be here. Kind of returning a favor, I suppose, and it's great to kind of bring a new voice into your podcast, even if it's my own, But you, Stephanie and Vanna, you've been doing an awesome job. I'm really impressed. I'm really engaged with what you're doing.
Thank you.
And for listeners who maybe haven't picked up on it, you guys were both guests on my podcast a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. We talked about 3 feminist films from early 1970s, and so it seemed to kind of make sense that we were talking about 12 Angry Men. Feminist films, Angry Men,
balancing it out, on the scale, balancing it.
Yeah, so I appreciate the invitation. You kind of gave me a list of some of the titles coming up, and it's like, I know this film pretty well. I've actually kind of taught it or led discussions on it with a group of men at my church a couple years ago, and I think it's a pretty important film, and I think also just the times we're living in. This is a film that has a message for today. Maybe a timeless message. Mm-hmm. It's maybe dated in some ways, and we can get into some of those aspects, but overall, I think it's a great, important film, and I'm really eager to hear your reactions and to share my own thoughts on it.
Perfect. All right, so let's get into the bio, who stars in it, who directed it, and everything. So 12 Angry Men is a film that came out in 1957, and the plot is a jury holdout attempts to prevent a miscarriage of justice by forcing his colleagues to reconsider the evidence. This was directed by director Sidney Lumet, and it stars Martin Balsam, John Fiedler, Lee J. Cobb, E.G. Marshall, Jack Klugman, Edward Binge, Jack Warden, Henry Fonda, Joseph Sweeney, Ed Begley, George Voskevic, and Robert Weber. So, as per every episode, we usually, before we dive into the oh my god, every time I'm like spoiler bits. Every time we get in, spoilies, yes. Before we get into the spoilies, we talk about whether we just recommend the movie right off the bat, so that way it gives you time to pause this episode, watch it, and come back to it, or not watch it and just continue to listen. Yeah. So, David, with you being the guest on our show, and I mean, you did already kind of say you spoke about 12 mm-hmm. Angry Men and stuff mm-hmm. like that, and had many speeches about it. Do you recommend it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you're interested in American cinema, there's a lot of interesting angles from which to consider this movie. It's kind of an emergence of independent cinema. This was, even though Henry Fonda was a huge, Hollywood star, very familiar face, kind of a cultural icon. This was filmed in New York City by Sidney Lumet, a guy who came out of TV back when TV mm-hmm. was kind of like doing live teleplays, like what you were watching on your home TV was actually being acted almost simultaneously in the studio. So talk about, kind of doing a theatrical play performance, but you're doing it on live TV with an audience of millions. That's a really unique and almost kind of a lost form. I know they bring that kind of stuff back every once in a while, but, so sort of interesting technical stuff. Sidney Lumet went on to have an amazing career, really, mm-hmm. really important American director. And then the film itself, I think, is just a really, fascinating appeal to the conscience, that kind of like the movie you just talked about last week, Do the Right Thing. This is a movie that's about doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. Don't rush to judgment, consider all the possibilities, question your own biases and assumptions, and give humanity a break. Don't just take the easy option when it literally may cost somebody their life until you're absolutely sure of all the evidence. So in some ways, there's kind of an idealistic aspect to the film. I wish we lived in a society where people were so easily persuaded that if you just put the facts in front of them, they'll change their mind. We kind of seem like everybody's digging in and kind of resisting that, or at least a lot of people are. But it's a great piece of cinema, and just the filmmaking and the performers. That there's a great cast here. Some of the people went on to become fairly famous and well-known in other aspects, but they were a lot of, unknowns or semi-knowns at the time. So, yeah, an important film, one I think that is really something that most film viewers should be at least familiar with.
Yeah.
And Savanna, what did you think?
Oh, I definitely recommend it. One of the things I think is very unique about this movie is it's pretty much solely based on dialogue. And I don't think there's a lot of movies that can pull them off. I obviously there are a few, but I think this movie does it so well. The back and forth is just riveting. And the way I even love the way the jurors are like introduced. I think the whole film is brilliant like that. And I pretty much agree with David. I think this is an important part of American cinema, and it's still what, like, I think it's 60, more than 60 years old, still relevant to today. So yeah, great film. What about you, Steph?
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a great, like, especially for those who are looking to learn more about film or even just writing. Like, this is definitely one of the top films you should look at in terms of writing dialogue. Because here you have all seemingly, 12 men, very similar in their own ways, but very, very different through their own use of words. And I also love this movie because it kind of pioneered one of my favorite, I guess, not really a genre, but a kind of type of film. And that would be, people stuck in a room pointing fingers at each other.
Ooh, I didn't realize that.
I love, like, I love that genre because it can be used in so many ways. Like, here you have it used in a dramatic, court/criminal sense. Meanwhile, if you take almost like the vertebrae, the structure of this film, and apply it to other films, like other categories, horror and, things like that, you can easily go from a film like this to go to one of my favorite films of all time, The Thing, or another great film, Hateful Eight. So I thought it was like a pioneer in one of my favorite categories of filmmaking, where you have not necessarily the sense of paranoia, but just people stuck in a room until something has to be done, all pointing fingers in every single way, every single direction. So I really, really appreciate this film for that. And I myself would definitely recommend it. So let's talk about characters. Now, Savanna, were there any? So for those who do not know, there's not a lot of, only in the end, 2 out of the 12 character names are revealed. But other than that, everyone just kind of goes by, juror number 1 or through juror number 12. So Savanna, was there any particular actor/character that really stood out to you when you watched this film?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Henry Fonda, who's kind of the conscience of all these men, who plays the conscience, he's fantastic. I haven't seen a lot of his films, truthfully, but I just thought he did such a great job at being the voice of reason. I don't know the other person's name, but the man who sort of makes the speech about those people. He said, you know how those people are? They kill, they steal. I thought that was such an amazing scene because you see all the men turn their back to this person.
That's Ed Begley. He's the garage owner. He's the real loudmouth. He's kind of the most overt racist who brings in kind of that issue, that implication that those people can't be trusted. They're menace to society. They're wild animals. Actually, It's a different character who uses the menace to society phrase, but he's the one who really gives full voice to, we ought to just, put them away, get rid of them. We're better off without them. And the full-fledged bigotry right there. Yeah.
And I loved it because it's 2 opposites in the film. They parallel each other very well. So those were my 2 favorites, but I really think all the actors hold their own in this movie. I think they're all sort of unique in a way. And I think it's really cool when you can see that in a film, especially when it's 12 white men who are very similar, but no, and I mean that in a great way, but bring their own to the movie, bring their own, at one point you can kind of distinguish each character. So I really love that about the movie. What about you guys? Any characters that you thought were great, cool?
Well, why don't you go, David?
Okay, yeah. I mean, what I'll say is maybe just to sort of step back a little bit before delving further into individual characters, is like you really kind of have 12 kind of archetypes of the American man, especially of the late 50s, and really those archetypes and sort of the and again, the implicit assumptions that white men run this world, that we're the decision makers. We kind of, set the limits and enforce the rules and expect everybody else to comply. So if you're a minority, a person of color, a woman, et cetera, here's how things work. This is how the game is played. And the movie never really, openly questions or challenges that, because it's all baked into the formula. Of course, there's 12 white guys who are going to make the decision on this. There's no diversity. There's not even any kind of a head nod towards inclusion. I guess you got one guy who's a European immigrant, who's presumably a naturalized citizen. I don't think if he wasn't a citizen, he wouldn't be allowed to be on the jury. But that is an interesting sort of a historical artifact, if you will, for younger viewers such as yourselves and many others, who is like, wow, I don't even think you could get a jury like that unless it's in a small town or in a very non-diverse community. But obviously, this is a situation that took place. The defendant is shown on screen. He's a Latino man and a young man too, a teenager. Again, he's just sort of put there on display, and there's some dialogue back and forth. And what you see is the debate. He was brought up in rough circumstances. He was physically abused. He didn't have good role models. His mother died when he was still a child. All of these terrible things happened to him. And so Henry Fonda and those who kind of gradually begin to understand his perspective and maybe identify with it and take it unto themselves say, maybe we do need to take into consideration his background and why we would draw the conclusion that this kid just has to be guilty because he's one of those people, right? The other side, of course, is sort of in their unquestioned prejudice. Well, he's a wild man. He's a maniac. He's a killer, and we need, the sooner we can get rid of him, the better off the rest of us will be. And they just sort of camp out in that sense of, just send him away. It doesn't bother me. We don't owe him a thing. And that's kind of a very vivid debate that was going on at the time, and in some ways continues. It's a little bit more nuanced now. There's a lot more voices that are being listened to or part of that conversation. But that's really one of the powerful things about this film, is that it really brings these issues to the surface and puts it in a way that's, engaging to the audience, and also just forces people to think about, where do you fall in? And for a white guy like myself, I look at these different characters and say, I can identify with some of them. Some of them are like, those are the guys I really don't like. I don't really want to have them in my life, but they're there, and you recognize that they still have power and clout and influence. And it's just kind of part of this ongoing dialogue and dilemma of how do you get people to sit back and shut up and just listen for a little bit. And I think that's a huge part of what's going on right now. I recognized, many years ago, the doors of privilege that are open to me because of my sort of ethnographic categories that I fit in. But I have a responsibility to understand how life looks and feels and is lived by people who don't check all those boxes that I do. And so there is that part is just tell me what it's like and how can I accommodate, how can I adjust and understand? And I think that's what this movie is kind of getting at. So, I think, that the old guy, kind of the old sassy senior citizen guy who's kind of one of the first to rally around Henry Fonda. I kind of dig him. He seems like he's lived some life and has learned some things along the way, and has maybe come to understand some of the blind spots and the limitations that prejudice kind of instills in people. And, once Henry Fonda sort of takes that risk to say, you know what, I don't even know what the verdict is, but let's just talk about it before we send this kid off to the electric chair. I mean, that's just it's a brave stance, especially when everybody else is just like, hey, let's get out of here. The ball game starts in a couple hours. I got to go home and get some dinner and all of that. Everybody just wants to be expedient about it. And it's kind of sickening to think that that's the approach they would take when somebody is going to literally die as a result of their decision. And yet they just kind of shrug it off like, yeah, whatever, not my problem.
Yeah, and they look at that old man character, especially one of the first to actually go, you know what? Maybe we actually should consider this. Everyone just looks at him like, look at this old coot. Like, we're not going to listen to him. And then in the end, he actually gives one of the most, I guess you could say, one of the most valuable reasonings to kind of reconsider everything. I totally agree with you, David. I think it does show so many different types of personalities within an American citizen. And so you have, you know, like you said, the immigrant, you have the two different types of old men you come across, the real sweet grandpa types that you want to be adopted by. And then you have the ones that, like, if you throw your ball on their yard, they're going to start screaming at you. Like it just showed it
pull a gun on you or something, right?
Yeah. So it just showed like this huge, like within 12 characters showed the most, probably one of the best representations of American men. Even in today's standards, like I can definitely point out people who I'd be like, okay, this dude would be Martin Balsam. This dude would be, you know, just within people I've met in life. Mm-hmm. And I like also how not all of them, one of the things I appreciate about this film are not like super rough and tough. And obviously you have some characters, like especially Henry Fonda's character, who's a little bit more softer and stuff like that. For a movie that has entirely an all-male cast, there's still almost like a touch of feminism. It's very balanced in a way. And I say feminism meaning like it kind of dives into some characters will tap into more emotions that are, I would assume, to be more in touch with a female than in a male. Mm-hmm. And using that kind of like balances the playing field for all of them. So I think all the characters are just immensely well written, and the transformations that people go through, and when they start realizing, oh, this isn't just a yes or no, this isn't just a guilty or not guilty, this is someone's life is actually in our hands. And once they start realizing that, I just think that it was so just well written. And personally, I love the movie On the Waterfront. So I really like Lee J. Cobb. I feel like he was such a powerhouse from the beginning and up until the end. And I liked his transformation, and because every time, like at the end, when everyone is saying not guilty and he's still like going, no, guilty just cuz. And we're like all trying to figure out, but why? It ends up being that he brought part of his own life into, you know, his dilemma, his own hatred, anger, and his own issues into the courtroom. And so I really enjoyed him, and also Martin Balsam, but I also do really like him in Psycho as well. But
I do have a question, if anybody knows it. Was this considered a controversial film for its time, or is this praised? Because I could see it being either way. I don't actually know.
Yeah, well, it didn't do like huge box office, which is kind of an interesting question. Maybe we can come back to that as far as popular entertainment. It was very well respected. Okay, the screenwriter Rose, I think, I can't remember his last name, but
Reginald
Rose, right? So he was pretty well known as a quality writer for TV dramas, you know, and you know, it's kind of like there's an appeal to the sort of the intellectual class, if you will, kind of the intelligentsia of its time. You know, the origins of this film was as a teleplay in 1954, and was adapted for the big screen on a very low budget. Sidney Lumet was brought in as director because he could work for cheap. You know, he was a TV guy, wasn't really well known for anything. Henry Fonda probably gobbled up a lot of the budget, honestly, just to get a name in there. And Henry Fonda, I mean, he's definitely worth talking about just for a moment to say, you know, who was this guy? Well, you know, a lot of people maybe know him as Jane Fonda's father, and Peter Fonda is one of his other sons, who, you know, had their own careers, and Jane Fonda in particular has had an amazing career, and gone through different incarnations as a cultural influencer over the years. But, you know, Henry Fonda, I mean, he really is like an American icon. He played young Mr. Lincoln. He was Wyatt Earp. He was Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, you know. So he took on these roles of kind of these kind of almost mythic personalities from American history, and his image, and I think it was a very well deserved. This was not just hype and fluff and glitz. He was a man who really personified decency and integrity and moral courage. And so I think, he was probably attracted to this role. Again, there in the TV production, a different, actors, except for the one old man that we've already talked about. I think that most of the actors were recast for this film. But Henry Fonda brought a certain prestige to it. He was kind of like, a personality that you could really trust, like maybe a Morgan Freeman or somebody like that, Denzel Washington nowadays, people that are universally admired because they just do things the right way. They mean what they say. There's no scandal or dirty business associated with their name or reputation. So that's kind of Henry Fonda. The movie got some Academy Award nominations. It didn't win anything. Bridge on the River Kwai was kind of the big blockbuster, big, widescreen war drama spectacle, David Lean and all of that, big explosions. And it's an incredible film and totally deserved all the wins that it got. But 12 Angry Men was in consideration and was kind of elevated as an important film. But like I say, it's not a movie that raked in audiences that just everybody just had to go down and see it. So it was a little bit more of a prestige product, but it's certainly grown in reputation over the years, and it's part of the National Film Registry now, and is pretty much one of those 8 or 9 star classics that almost everybody agrees on. This is a big one.
Yeah, it's number 5 on IMDb in terms of like top 250 movies ever made on like their big list. So, I mean, I do you guys believe that it deserves a spot that high? What do you think, Savanna?
No, I don't want to go first. That's hard.
Okay, I'll throw it to David. So, David, do you think it like deserves like number 5 on like the IMDb ranking?
Well, I wouldn't put it as my number 5 movie of all time, but I mean, the fact that it appeals to that many people, I mean, IMDb is kind of like the McDonald's of movie ratings or something, right?
Yeah.
And so
everyone has access to it.
Exactly. And it's got the biggest worldwide audience of people who will actually vote to give it a rating. So whether it deserves it or not, it got it. It earned it, right? I mean, you got The Godfather and maybe a few other things, Shawshank Redemption above it. I haven't looked at that list in a while, but it's that highly elevated. It's one of the reasons I chose it for my men's group at church, is like, even people who've seen it, this movie gives you a ton of stuff to talk about, just as far as, being a person of conscience and being a person who's willing to sort of buck the popular trend and say, hey, wait a minute, let's rethink this. And we need more of that in this society. I mean, we are hurting for people who will stop and take a nuanced look and say, okay, let's really consider everybody's point of view here. At a certain point, you have to make a decision. It's not like just talk all day and never draw a conclusion. But before you draw those conclusions, let's really hear each other out, including people who disagree with us. I mean, everybody digs in and everybody's like on the attack. And it's I mean, we're reaping the fruits, that the bitter harvest of all that division and strife, when we just really need to do a lot more listening to each other and thinking about why people are saying and feeling the way they do.
Yeah, I could agree with that. I think my dilemma with this is, like David said, these kind of movies need to be seen because the meaning behind this is amazing. But at the same time, it's definitely not my top 5. But right. My favorite movie is Goodfellas, and what does that give to the world, So
sheer raw entertainment. That's what.
So yeah, I do have trouble deciphering. Like, okay, like this is a fantastic movie with a fantastic meaning, but top 5 is very, very high. Stephanie, what do you think?
I do think in terms of, I could see it being top 5 in terms of importance to film history, for sure. Because like I said, you have the well-written dialogue. And for this movie came out in 1957. For its time, I could see it not receiving a lot of good flack because, this was before the Civil Rights Movement and everything. Well, I guess you could say like before the end of the Civil Rights Movement in 1968. This was still during the time when it was building up. But I do think it's a film everyone should see. It's not in my top 25, but I don't discredit to be a bad movie in any sense of the way. It's just, I mean, like my top 5, you're going to go from like The Thing to Last Tango in Paris to whatever else. Like my top 5 and everything is all over the place. But in terms of like film history and film significance, I definitely think like films like this should be taught and educated, not only in terms of like maybe history or English literature, but definitely in film courses as well. I think it's a movie that it still stands the test of time today, especially the message within it of, you know, diving in and like, because almost this opinion of like your own opinions and what you think and what you bring to the table can and will affect others. And I think obviously with today's current climate, a movie like this should be rewatched, should be revisited. And I do think it might not be one of the best movies ever made, but it's definitely one of the more important ones ever made.
Mm-hmm. And with IMDb, what that means is a lot of people are giving it 8, 9, and 10-star reviews. That's really all it means. And there may not be more than a handful of people who think this is my number 5 movie of all time. I mean, you know, but a lot of people really respect it and admire it and say, go see this movie. So that's basically what it is. You know, what personal top 10 lists are going to have so much variance based on when you saw it. I mean, like my favorite film of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I saw it when I was a 7-year-old kid in 1968 in the theater. Of course, it completely blew my gaskets. I had no idea what was going on, but the spaceships were really cool, you know, and all of that. Yeah. But I've rewatched it many, many times over the years. I've introduced my children to it. I've watched it with friends. I've just seen it in lots of different settings. And so I have this deep personal relationship with this film. I mean, there's no other film that will ever surpass it because that film's been with me all my life, you know? And so similar to Goodfellas or The Thing or whatever, you know, they mean a lot to you because of how it informs just who you are as a person coming of age and all of that. So, you know, that's all fine. I think it's very fascinating to kind of get into people's individual quirks and obsessions about what makes their favorite movies, even though that may not necessarily line up with your own personal, you know, top 10 or whatever.
Absolutely. And although too, so even when it does obviously have this, you know, great message, it has a great, well-written story. I do want to say that the acting is phenomenal. Like this is definitely a type of movie where if someone was like, oh, I want to learn more about acting and stuff like that, I would be pointing to this one, like definitely in like a list of 10 films, I would be pointing to this because to have and even directing too, for it to be shot all in the same room and just pointing the camera differently at everyone without it seeming, you know, like it drags, you know, I think it has great pacing. I think overall, not only does the story and everything of this film hold the test of time, but even the directing and acting techniques in here, I think are pretty relevant and pretty timeless. And I think it does a really good job with that. Even though it's a little bit more on the basic side, it shows so much with what you can do with so little. What do you think about that, David? Like, what do you think in terms of like how it presents itself? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think this is a movie that stands up very well to like, you know, rigorous analysis. If you really want to get into the filmmaking techniques, you know, the acting, I'll just reference others that stood out to me in terms of characters. I really like Jack Warden. He's the kind of the wise guy, the Yankee fan, the guy in the little hat at the end of the other end of the table. You know, he's just kind of one of these knuckleheads who just wants to get in and out and get back to his good old times. And yeah, he just does a great job of just sort of capturing the essence of that type of guy. You know, really. Again, all the actors really, you know, nail it. And some of them, you know, like the number 5, he doesn't play as big of a role, but you know, you got E.G. Marshall, the stockbroker here, Mr. You know, analytical, just the facts. You can tell he's probably got the most net worth of anybody in that room. You know, just really interesting things. But getting back to the filmmaking, you know, the actors do their thing, but there's also a strategy that's being pursued by both Sidney Lumet and the cinematographer Boris Kaufman of kind of just gradually zooming in, and until by the end of the film, you're just getting these full on close ups. You're seeing the pores and the sweat on the forehead, and the hairline and everything else. And I have never seen this on the big screen, but I just wonder what that would be like, seeing those faces and 25 feet across detail. Because the power of the emotion and the tension that's ratcheting up just constantly as the votes start to slide from guilty to not guilty, and those who are clinging to guilty and trying to get this over with, they're becoming almost desperate, trying to figure out, how can I stop this from sliding away? And again, I'll just tap into some of the issues of today. When you see some of the abusive reactions from politicians, police chiefs, people who in some ways are invested in the status quo, whether they want to overtly continue racism, or whether they just want to keep their sense of being an authority and in charge of things. Culturally right now, it feels like in some very significant ways they are losing the narrative. That even the middle of the road, the independents, the moderates or whatever, are saying, you know what, we gotta give Black Lives Matter more respect and more of a listening ear, rather than just getting defensive about it. And I applaud that. But the people who have been resisting that, including our president and others, are really kind of losing it, because they're recognizing that their arguments are just not as persuasive as they think they should be, or as they used to be. And that's really the power of this film, is people who want to perpetuate prejudice and guilty until proven innocent type of thinking, or marginalizing people who don't fit into the mainstream of society from whatever angle. They're losing the argument over time. Each generation that comes up gets people thinking, you know what, we really have to put these old prejudiced ways behind us. And it's discouraging to me to think my own generation, I'm 58 years old, still seems to be more of an obstacle than an outlet to really engage in constructive change. But we just had a big family gathering yesterday with me and my kids, and we were talking about this stuff. I said to my sons, who are all in their early 30s, you know what, this is time for your generation to rise up. I wish I could say my generation did a better job, and I'll support, but I think we need to get some new leadership, new voices, and new visions in there. And that's the encouraging part of what I see happening around us these days. And I hope a movie like this is actually ultimately encouraging to younger people to say, let's be the voice of conscience. Let's go ahead and stand up and say, you know what, that's how it maybe worked in the past, but that doesn't have to be how we continue on in the future. We can do better. And and so this movie, the filmmaking techniques bring us into that tension, and really kind of, if you're paying attention at all, you realize what the stakes are here, because people who wanted to just send this kid to the chair and be done with him and move on and go home and have a nice dinner, they realize it's not going to be that easy, and that society really is making some progress, slow and painful as it may often be.
Absolutely. I entirely agree. So what at this point, so in the film, there's so many different things that are brought up to attention. So David and Savanna, did you guys have any moment in the film where you because obviously the gears shift a lot within this film as they start bringing up new things that people didn't notice, whether it be glasses, the knife, the train and everything like that. Did you guys have any particular details that stood out to you that when was brought to the table, you were like, whoa, because I had that moment when the guy, they should put the knife in the table, and then the guy's like, you can get that anywhere. And they're like, no, you can't. And he takes a knife and he just sticks it on the table, his own version of the knife. I thought that scene was brilliant. Was there any scenes for you guys that you felt the same way?
Definitely the glasses scene.
The glasses.
That is such a small detail that this guy noticed and brings up quite later in the film, if you notice too. And it's just one of those moments where you're just like, wow, this kid is, in my opinion, I don't think he's guilty. I think that's what the film was trying to say, where you're just like, he's definitely not guilty.
Mm-hmm. I think also, like, whether or not guilty, the whole point of a film like this is, if there is, like, in terms of our justice system, it's not always about guilty or not guilty. It's in terms of absolutely undeniably guilty or with some reasonable doubt,
Right,
that they
that's what
go
I meant.
over and discuss about. And I like the fact that they highlight that, because a lot of people who go into, jury duty or in the court system, or have to make some type of executive decision like that, just because their opinion sways to like one side, that doesn't mean, if there's any, you have to be fair, you have to be unbiased about it. And I really liked all the little details that all these different characters, brought to the table. So, David, did you have any particular detail that you really enjoyed?
Well, I think just the idea that these two kind of elderly witnesses, one across the way on the other side of the train tracks, and then the old man who lived downstairs, they both gave witness testimony saying they had, supposedly firsthand evidence of seeing the killing take place. And yet, when you start really getting into the details of what they testified to, you see contradictions between both of their accounts. How can the man hear the killing happen while there's this loud elevated train going right by his apartment,
Yeah.
And that's how the woman supposedly saw that. But as Vanna said, she didn't have her glasses on, and her vision is dim. And how can you make out that level of you might see bodies, or you might see something, but you can't identify who the person was who was doing the stabbing at that point. And the fact that the defense attorney, the government appointed defense attorney, because this was a poor man, he didn't have a money for an attorney, he had no connections, nobody was going to pick up his case pro bono, and the defense attorney basically just mailed it in, like they just figured out this is a paycheck here. They're not really throwing any passion or imagination or challenge into doing what they do. And that in itself is a problem with our justice system. And again, I'm not here to slam as a category defense attorneys or public defenders, because I know there are people who specifically take that job. They do it with a cause and with a mission, with a purpose, because they want to be advocates for people who don't have those advantages. But too often, especially in big city environments or even in rural environments for that matter, public defenders, it's just kind of an easy job. You don't have to go hustling for clients. They kind of send them your way. You show up, you do your thing, you hang it up. And I can easily imagine the cynicism that might develop if you've been doing that job for a while, especially when, public defenders, let's face it, they do have to stand up on behalf of people who actually did commit the crimes that they're accused of. So it's a complicated business, to say the least. But the fact that the defender didn't really challenge the witnesses, just kind of let whatever they wanted to say go into the public record and leave it as unquestioned gospel for the jury to say, well, that must be what happened because that's what they said,
Yeah.
But you dig in, it's like, oh, you know what? These people might have their own bias as well. And again, that's just one of those other messages that's kind of like the concluding thing of the film too, is we all bring our own baggage to this. We all project our own needs, insecurities, inadequacies, our own frustrations and resentments. We can get rid of this kid because I don't have the capacity to put my own son in order, and he's disappointed me, and we have all these unresolved issues. But I can sort of take my anger out on him. Yeah, right.
I will say, I agree with David that, this film makes you take a very scary look at the justice system, especially 60 years ago. After watching this movie, you can't help but think, how many disadvantaged people, how many minorities were sent to jail for things they didn't do, or things that people weren't 100% sure that people died because of these prejudices. And I think the film even now makes you take a really scary look at it, because in the beginning of the movie, they're all just talking. They're all just like, yeah, whatever, let's just get this over with. We'll just guilty, throw out a guilty. And I know for me, if I was put in that decision, I'd be screaming in my head the whole time because I would be so nervous. But most of these men were just kind of like, yeah, we got a baseball game later. I'm hungry, whatever. And it's
it
very
is what
scary.
it is, and there's no changing it type of thing.
Yeah,
Right. It's hot.
scary.
I'm sweating. I need to change my shirt. That basic. And again, to get into the gender aspect of it, I mean, the fact that it's just 12 white guys who are making the decision. I mean, what you just said, Vanna, about, sort of the stress you would be feeling if it's like, I've got to make a life or death decision on this kid, this young man. A lot of guys are not conditioned to really think that empathetically, if you will, or that sensitive to somebody who doesn't sort of fit their peer group. And that's just a sad reality, but that is, in a very real and graphic sense, that's just kind of a huge blind spot that is part of American history, and certainly not just limited to this nation. I mean, especially in the West, white men have sort of had this patriarchal thing that they've been running for centuries. And it's only been in the last several decades, really starting from the 60s, when we needed to get women's voices and people of different ethnic backgrounds in the mix as far as decision makers and jury members and lawmakers and public spokesmen and advocates and all of that. You sort of see, and that's just another endorsement for this film. You may not like what you see, but it's the reality. These are the roots of our contemporary political order. And that's where a lot of the backlash comes from, is from people who are used to things being run a certain way. When Donald Trump says "Make America Great Again," he's saying, let's get back to how things were back in the 50s, when we had a certain group of people who made all the decisions and everybody else had to sort of sit back and deal with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've asked for some reviews, I've asked this question, and I want to ask this question to you guys. So a film like this that is so relevant today, could it be remade? And should it be remade? Because we're living in a whole world where, like, every week, something remade, rebooted, or sequeled happens to come across. David, from you personally, especially since you have spoken about this and you really praise this film, could you see this film being remade, and would you even want this film to be remade?
Well, it has been remade, actually. There was a 1980s version. Gosh, let me look it up real quick a second. I think
that's
sorry
interesting.
About that. Yeah, no, and there's a Russian version as well. Let me just bear with me a second. I'll just look it up.
No, you're good. I'm looking up this info too, because I never heard of it.
So it's a 1997 TV movie by William Friedkin, that guy who did The Exorcist, right? And Sorcerer. Yeah, I mean, Friedkin, right? So Friedkin did this with Jack Lemmon, George C. Scott, Hume Cronin. I mean, that's a pretty killer cast right there. I have not seen it, but
is it still titled as 12 Angry Men?
Absolutely, yeah. This is a teleplay. This is a TV script that was written, so it's adaptable. It's also been done on stage. There's a stage version that has been adapted, and like I say, there's a Russian version as well. If you got the Blu-ray, the Criterion edition, there's some supplements talking about sort of the larger cultural impact of this story. In the TV version, you do have Ossie Davis, Courtney Vance, Dorian Harwood. So you've got some men of color. Let's see, McKelty Williamson, he's juror number 10. So you've got a much more diverse.
Oh, wow. Ossie Davis from Do the Right Thing is in it.
Right, exactly. Edward James Olmos. Right.
The mayor.
So yeah, that really would be fascinating, because now you do have a variety of men from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different ethnicities, and all of that. So it would be fascinating to see if they changed some of the attitudes and motivations. In fact, boy, now I'm kind of hyped up to go check this out. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I do feel like, this is a film that, and a script, let's just say, that has a long shelf life and could be, in the right hands, adapted skillfully to speak to our times. In fact, as I'm looking at the photos on MDB, it looks like the judge is a woman. So that's another little interesting aspect here. So yeah, maybe something to kind of nudge viewers to check out. I don't know how to access it. I guess Prime Video has it for $3.99 rental or purchase. So yeah, something maybe I'll follow up on from there.
I never heard of like, because I asked if it was a remake because I'm thinking like, oh my god, more than ever could we use a remake,
Right.
but who knew, like, I never ever thought that apologies to William Friedkin, but I never thought it was actually redone or anything. If anything, it would have been almost remade as under a different name, maybe like a, based off 12 Angry Men. I would have maybe assumed that, but
Right.
Yeah.
wow, I did not know. But even then, so 1997, that's still 20 years ago.
Yeah,
Right.
James Gandolfini from The Sopranos, Tony Danza, old TV actor from Taxi and other things. I mean, what a cast.
We might need to check this out.
Yeah.
So even with that, that happening, so the 97 happening over 20 years ago.
Right.
So from there, do you still think, with already a remake, do you still think another one could be done to kind of fit even more modern times?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you obviously we wouldn't most likely have a capital punishment case. I mean, that certainly raises the stakes in the original here, because it's not even put him away in prison for 20 or 30 years. It's like it. And that's the thing. When you render judgment on a capital case, there's no going back. There's no, well, there may be appeals, but it's a very ultimate type of decision that you're making. And the fact that this is a young man, an 18-year-old who's grown up again in abusive conditions. I mean, there is maybe more of an opening for a reasonable doubt than if it's like, well, they're going to have to just go to prison, and we're just going to kind of quote unquote play it safe because there's a pretty good chance he might have done it. Yeah. I do agree that I think the evidence points to a not guilty verdict. There's a lot of reason to think that the witnesses did not have credibility to make the charges that they did, and because of that, you really cannot pin the killing on this kid.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Savanna, so what do you think? I mean, now knowing that there's a 97 version, do you think that a movie like this could be redone? And if you have any opinions on how it could be, share it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, even though it was 20 years ago, especially for everything that's going on right now, I think we can definitely use a remake, especially things that include the justice system and just unfairness. Like, this could definitely use a reboot for sure. I think it would even benefit this,
I think so too. I think one of the reasons why I thought, like, dang, I would want to see a remake is because the one character who always is juror number 12, who's always talking about him working in the advertisement agency and how, I came up with this cereal box thing. I was like, John Hamm, please.
Yes.
John Hamm in Mad Men. Bring him on. Like, that was automatically what I thought of.
Yeah.
I was amused when you introduced me as juror number 12. I was like, what are you saying about me? Mr. Glitton, Quippy, and all that. Right? No, it's fine.
Totally random for that part. But it's just things like that. The only thing, so I could see that being done. Obviously, definitely having a more diverse cast. Even though it's kind of assumed in 12 Angry Men that the kid on trial is a person of color, I do like how it's not specified. And I think that if there were to be a remake, I think that would be good as well. Maybe using a young kid who, seems mixed, or, you just can't tell. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't, for that kid who's on trial, it does not matter, what color or anything. Obviously, to these jurors' eyes, it will matter some way, somehow. But I do like how they didn't totally specify, the ethnic background of the character. And I hope if they do a remake of it, I kind of hope that they would do that again, because I think it made for a lot of more, I don't know, coverage, a lot of more coverage, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But yeah,
well,
I definitely, I think I'd like to see this be remade for sure.
I have a question again. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
So I've actually never been anywhere close to a court house, sort of like a jury. I've never had jury duty before. Mm-hmm. Have you guys had any experiences? Is this like a very realistic thing that happens? I'm assuming it is. I've never had any of those experiences.
Yeah, so I've never made it. Sure. I've never made it to the jury room. I've been called for jury duty a few times in my life. Once out when I lived out in California, there was a guy who had been picked up on a shoplifting charge, and I very sincerely said at the time, I just don't really want to take responsibility for sending a guy to jail. So I was dismissed pretty quickly, you know. And a couple other times that I've been called up, they've settled before they actually got to trial. So I can't say exactly what it feels like in a jury room, but everything I've read says, you know, people who do like, you know, court trials and attorneys and people who work within the law system have praised this film because it does give a unique look at, you know, the pressures facing juries, and it felt realistic and you know, pretty plausible. You know, obviously you can always make the critique that, you know, it kind of is scripted to turn out a certain way, and that the jurors, you know, end up actually being willing to change their mind when they're confronted with the evidence. Kind of what I said earlier. Sure. Often in today's society, people just will not back down. In fact, that's become sort of an art form, is how do you resist the power of the evidence and still cling to your opinion despite whatever, you know.
Oh my God, I see that on social media way too often.
Right. And that's the thing. And in a certain way, this film almost feels a little too good to be true, that, you know, within the course of an hour, you can get people who are ready to send a guy to the electric chair to say, you know what, maybe there is a reasonable doubt. Maybe we'll all join together and give him a not guilty and let him walk free. I mean, yeah, God bless people who can, you know, really allow the evidence to persuade them. It's a challenging thing, especially nowadays. It seems like, boy, if I give in here, they're just going to steamroll all over me. It's like we have to find a way out of that trap, because that's basically where ignorance and prejudice get just kind of cooked right into our brain. If we feel like we can't admit maybe we made a mistake, or we drew a hasty conclusion, or that other people are suffering because I'm insisting on this, you know, sort of the all lives matter thing. Like, I'm just going to keep throwing that out there. It's like, you don't realize how hurtful that is. Maybe you're trying to make a sincere point, but you're really causing a lot of pain and offense to other people who don't deserve that. And so step back, be humble, you know, be teachable. That's all we're asking.
Absolutely. I came close to being on a jury once. Yeah. And one of the things I will say with our court system, it's like I was 19 and almost about to be on a court for a case about like sexual abuse and stuff. So I'm like, okay, maybe we could go back somewhere in the laws and like with certain cases and stuff like that. Like, it's the fact that it's like and I made through like 3 rounds before being like in the final pick.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, you did.
Yeah, it was not a fun time. It was a lot of like just sitting around staring at walls, and I couldn't use my phone. Oh, the process was awful. But, and I mean, at some point, like, yeah, I do think jury duty is a civil service that everyone should do. But just putting in a 19-year-old to like, it was just like, I'm happy they didn't choose me, because I mean, I was 19 at the time. How am I going to, you know, be a part of a crowd and analyze, like pretty much be given evidence, analyze it, and then make a conscious decision when everyone else on that jury would have been between 40 and 60. And here I am, 19 years old, fresh out of the womb, going, yeah, I'll make a decision about someone's life. Yeah. So I do kind of in a way critique that. But other than that, the questions and stuff like that are asked are similar to the questions that, because obviously when picking out a jury, they do ask like, how would you feel if you were asked about this? Because they want to pick the most, you know, unbiased people for the role. They want to pick the people who are going to be the most neutral overall, to have the most accurate, you know, decision making, and to avoid, you know, people like Lee J. Cobb, you know, people who are just bringing in resentment and hate, and also to avoid bringing in people who are just like, I want to go to a baseball game, you know, things like that. But I thought it was, in terms of what my little experience was, pretty similar. But then again, I was never picked for the jury. But the questions and the pondering and all the details and everything about remaining neutral, and the difference between guilty and not guilty versus, absolutely undeniably guilty and, room to, what was the phrase again? Room to doubt or room for doubt?
Reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
Reasonable doubt. Yeah. So that definitely was mentioned in terms of like, oh, if you are picked, here's your role. This is what you got to do. So I even like that was 2 or 3 years ago that happened to me. So it is still very relevant. And I was surprised at how similar it was. And knowing like, oh yeah, like the whole feel of this movie was definitely the feel of sitting in the, in the courtroom and everything like that. The judge talking to all of you, things like that.
Interesting.
But yeah, that's the only closest experience I got. I don't know anyone else who's been. It's funny. I don't know anyone else. My parents have never been, jury like summoned or anything like that. And then me, like the first year I can be eligible, I get picked. And I'm like, great. But yeah, so that was just my little experience with it. But overall, I think is there anything else we want to talk about before we get into the rating of the film? David, do you have anything you want to discuss? Savanna?
No, I mean, maybe I'll just bring a little bit more attention to Boris Kaufman. He was the youngest brother of a trio of Russian filmmakers. Dziga Vertov, the man with the movie camera, is kind of a classic of the silent era, very innovative, kind of a lot of optical effects and kind of cool, interesting, almost kind of surrealist, just kind of amazing visuals that he put together. Dziga Vertov was not his birth name, but that was the older brother kind of adopted that name. But Boris Kaufman was a guy who emigrated from the Soviet Union, kind of roundabout way. He was the one who really specialized in a lot of these intense close-ups and just kind of the craft of getting right up in the actors' faces and capturing the emotions and all the nuances. I mean, that's the thing. There's so much kind of meta text to this movie. If you're just looking at the facial expressions, the nonverbal stuff that goes on beyond just the great dialogue that's been scripted, it's just the whole essence of each person kind of coming out there. Some people very complicated and kind of very heavyweight. Others maybe a little bit more side players, but they're still part of the process. And again, that's just another really essential part of this film. We can talk about all the issues that it raises, but just the humanity of how it's expressed and captured on film. It's just a really impressive piece of work. So I just want to kind of give a little props to all that.
Yeah, and I definitely agree, because another work that I'm a big fan of is The Fugitive Kind. And once again, Boris Kaufman and Sidney Lumet kind of, went tag team again, became another duo again for Fugitive Kind. But I do like in terms of their career, I do. And also Boris Kaufman was DP of On the Waterfront. So I do like, and I do get that sense, because this did not only with, Lee J. Cobb, it did have like an On the Waterfront kind of feel to it. Definitely. I think also because the character of, Terry Malloy and Henry Fonda's character are similarly like these underdogs just trying to bring justice and stuff like that. But I really enjoyed seeing the difference between 12 Angry Men, a film like this, all shot in one room, to The Fugitive Kind, a film that kind of, both Sidney and Boris kind of stuck with similar techniques, but also expanded, in my personal opinion. Did you ever see The Fugitive Kind? Did either of you ever see it?
I have not.
Yeah, I reviewed it years ago on my blog before I started doing podcast coverage. So that's with Marlon Brando and Anna Magnani. Pretty awesome little piece of work. It was just reissued by Criterion. Was it earlier this year as a Blu-ray? So it was a DVD.
Yeah, they came out with the DVD, a few years ago. I want to say like 5 years ago or so. They just had the DVD, and then they just did the Blu-ray release.
Right. So yeah, no, it's an excellent piece of work. Yeah, Kaufman's definitely had a very interesting career. The Pawnbroker is another great one of his. Uptight. I mean, you want to talk about some race-related issues. That's a 1968 film made by Jules Dassin, talking about sort of the Black Power movement of like 1968, like literally right at the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there was a lot of heavy stuff going on. And again, for younger listeners or just people of any age, really, watching these films and understanding the intensity of the discussions that were going on 40, 50 years ago is really important just to get it in context. It explains the frustration, but also the urgency of addressing these issues now and not just continuing to, operate on the treadmill of letting more decades go by before some kind of sense of real progress has been made. So, Kaufman was part of all of that. He's really had an amazing career. Of course, he's deceased now, stopped doing cinematography back in 1970. But definitely, if you want to get into well-made, well-shot films, he's a guy whose name is worth tracking down and watching his work.
Sidney Lumet too. He had quite the diverse career. I mean, after this, 20 years later, he did Dog Day Afternoon, which is such one of my favorite Al Pacino films ever. But yeah, so I think, overall, so Savanna, what is your rating of a movie of this film?
9 out of 10.
Solid 9. And David?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good zone to land on. I mean, it's a masterpiece of a sort, but I kind of save my 10s for, life transformational type or experiences I had that are, things that just kind of hit me on this really personal level. And this is pretty close. But, because it's maybe more on the issues or the technical stuff rather than, grabbing me by the heart, but it's right up there. Very strong.
I'm feeling an 8.7 just because since we talked about Fugitive Kind, I in terms of like Sidney Lumet's work, I definitely gravitate more towards Fugitive Kind than this, especially in terms of directing. But I still think it's a fantastic film, and like we all discussed, I think it's definitely something that should be taught in whether it be English, history, or film history. It definitely has its place for sure too in the Criterion. I don't think in terms of optimal picks for important films, in terms of film history, I definitely think this is one of the most deserving Criterion films out there.
Yeah, it took them a little while to get it. Yeah, and it's one of those kind of tentpole studio releases. I think it had many other editions before Criterion got a hold of it, and I think you're covering it just because of the way it fits into your sort of alphabetical numerical sequence, right?
Yeah. So last week we kind of went out of order, but we still like to do the one Criterion a week in numerical order. So so next week it's going to be 24 frames. So it was 12 Angry Men. Next is 24 frames.
Well, and the thing is, I have my own sort of arbitrary scheme of watching all the films in order of their chronological release, but it's just amazing how often, because you set up this kind of idea of how you're going to cover these films, and yet they sort of just land in your lap right at the right time. And I think this is a great time to watch and talk about 12 Angry Men. Yeah.
I didn't realize one of the similarities between 12 Angry Men and Do the Right Thing, because you had messaged me and you were like, oh, another film about the hottest day of the year. And
in New York City, right? Exactly. Yeah, everybody's at the boiling point, sweating and just kind of waiting for something to come along to break the heat, and but you roll the clock. I mean, 1988 was Do the Right Thing. This is a film that was released in 57. So roll it back 30 years, and it's just another hot day in New York City.
Yeah. Okay, so David, so not only you have Criterion Reflections, so why don't you tell us a little bit about exactly what your podcast, Criterion Reflections, entails?
So Criterion Reflections is a project I've been working on since 2009. In January of that year, I just kind of came up with this idea that I was going to cover all the films connected to Criterion in the chronological order that they were originally released. So I've been kind of steadily working on that. So back in 2009, and for quite a few years after that, it was just a blog. I would just watch a movie and sit down and write about it. It's kind of just started with, I always wanted to keep my notes, things I could sort of remember the impression that the film made on me. But then, things grow and people start reading your stuff and you build a little connection. And then the following year, I affiliated with CriterionCast.com, which is the website that I kind of publish all my stuff through nowadays, and started doing a podcast called The Eclipse Viewer, which was a podcast dedicated to the Eclipse series, which is kind of a DVD-only box sets that Criterion does. So I've been doing blogging and podcasting for about the last decade now. And then a couple of years ago, I decided to take Criterion Reflections, the blog, and turn it into a podcast so that now I do a podcast about the different films, and I've got this big spreadsheet where everything is kind of lined up based on when it was first released. So I'm kind of all the way up to 1971 now, and I'm kind of slowly making my progress through. So, and I'm enjoying the journey along the way. And as I already said, Stephanie and Savanna were guests on my show after I kind of discovered your program several weeks ago, and I've really enjoyed just kind of the friendship that we've developed. And I really, again, respect your work. I hope people who maybe followed me over here continue to listen to your show. I give a strong endorsement. You guys are doing fantastic job of covering important films and doing it with depth and substance. So more power to you.
You are too kind. Meanwhile, we should be bowing to you because you've been in the Criterion game and Criterion reviewing game for so long, almost
I've
a
actually,
decade career doing this.
I've actually been to the Criterion office. I have actually been in the closet. Yes, I'll send you a picture, private message. Yeah.
What? How did you get there?
I got my connections. I'll share that with you privately. But yeah, that's my little bragging point.
Oh my goodness. As soon as you mouthed that, my brain went, he went to the temple.
Yes,
like, what?
The inner sanctum. Yes, I actually had a couple hours. My wife and I were in New York City in 2017, and a good friend of mine, Ryan Gallagher, who runs the Criterion Cast website, he's been there as well, but he arranged for me and my wife to visit. I got 2 hours to talk with Peter Becker. I got to see the Olympics big box set video before it was ever released to the public. It was a really incredible afternoon of walking around and just checking out. I got to see restoration work in progress, and got to see some sneak previews of titles. Of course, they've all since been released by then. But yeah, it was an amazing moment. Yeah.
I needed to know this. This is like, you just went from almost like a sensei in Criterion to now God. We're at God level, God tier level in terms of the Criterion world.
Well, believe me, I was very privileged and very humbled to have that experience, and I just tried to burn as much into my brain as I could so I could just experience that whole situation. But I've dug deep into the Criterion well, and it's been a big piece of my life over the last 10 years. But I really appreciate shows like your own that are kind of taking the challenge on, as well, and bringing a fresh perspective to it. So, I've been doing a lot of blogging, podcasting. I've published, hundreds of reviews and hundreds of podcast episodes and talked about
and
hundreds
you bring
of
some really interesting guests. Like I had said on our last podcast, I really enjoyed the Bruce Lee box set episode you were talking about, and the guests that you brought on for that. Yeah,
Michael Worth, he's an action movie martial arts star. I mean, he's been in lots of different films, in both movies and TV. He's been to Hong Kong. He knows all the techniques, the kung fu and all that stuff, and he can give you the breakdown of all the different moves that people are making. And he's he never met Bruce Lee, of course, but he's met people who worked with Bruce Lee, and he's actually working on a project himself about putting some of the Bruce Lee imitator box set together. So he's got some really fascinating stuff. So again, this podcast has just been an avenue for me to meet really fascinating people, and even if they're not famous or connected, there are people with lots of interesting points of view. So what I do is I just have a spreadsheet. I get people on who have an angle or an insight to talk about movies that they really love and care about, and we just have a conversation about it. So I'm getting closer to the end of 1971, and then I talked about the Eclipse Viewer. My partner in that podcast is a guy named Trevor Barrett. He's an attorney, lives out in Utah, very well read, very smart guy, and he kind of just connected with me years ago when the Eclipse Viewer was a bit of a hiatus. My original co-host decided he was going to kind of move on and prioritize other things, which was fine. It was a very amicable split and all of that. Mm-hmm. But Trevor and I just started a new podcast called Inside the Box, and it's going to be dedicated to discussing the Criterion Collection's box sets, those big bricks that have several films all under one wrapper. And we just did our first episode, which is the 3 Silent Classics by Joseph von Sternberg. So that's out there. We're going to be doing Satyajit Ray's Apu trilogy next. That'll probably be sometime either
Okay, so you're going to be doing like trilogies and onward. You're not just going to be only doing like the Enigma or Bergman, like 90s.
That's not even a full course meal. That's like a stocked freezer full of film. So we're gonna kind of make it a little bit more digestible, and really the trilogies, maybe 4 or 5 film type of sets, and it's going to be like an hour and a half, just to kind of give an impression of what's in the box set. So we're not going to do like a full, I've been known to do like 2, sometimes even longer 2-hour episodes on a single film, but this will be a little bit more surface level. But it's really just talking about what do you get in the box. We'll talk about each film, but also the supplements, the packaging, the artwork, all that kind of stuff. It's just kind of a fun way of looking at sort of those deluxe editions that Criterion puts out there. Trevor and I have a great rapport. We've done many, many podcasts together. So that's kind of a new project, so that I'm not stuck in 1971 or eventually 1972 forever. A little bit more variety in my life,
That is awesome. And I'm just going to say on behalf of me and Savanna, the minute you guys go, you know what? Let's talk about Krzysztof Kieślowski's 3 colors.
Yeah.
Oh my God. We volunteer entirely. I'm just saying that right now, just getting it out there for the whole world to hear. We will be there. Give us a time and date if you would like us to be there.
You are on my list. Those are films that absolutely have to have women's perspectives. So your voices will be included there. We'll get to you. Okay.
Steph, I think we need to refer to him as Sensei David from now on.
Sensei David, yes. We have Homeboy James, our Patreon subscriber, and now we have Sensei David.
Well, you're too kind. I mean, this is just all for fun for me, but it's also, I will say this, it is fun, but it's also it's enriching. I mean, this has been an amazing quest. I've met great people through this, and it just challenges me to get beyond mere fandom. And fandom is great. I have no problems with fandom, but there's something deeper going on with these great movies, and to engage with them on that level, to really say, how does this kind of shape my life, or even change my life going forward, or through the conversation about whatever the film is about, how can I just become a better person, and how can I maybe share something of a positive nature with other people that I relate with. And to me, that's really, it's about the quality of life that you're living. Film can add to that, and it's not just entertainment. It's just not for kicks and giggles. It's to really engage with what's going on in our world and try to make a positive difference.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have all your links and everything like that, our episode that we did with him and everything like that, down in the bio below. Highly, 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 highly recommend that you check him out, and as well as all the other podcasts on Criterion Cast as well. Do any of you guys have anything else to say before we sign off?
No, I think we're
good. All right. Thank you everyone so much for listening. And thank you, David, so much for being a part of this episode. It definitely was really cool to have your insight on this.
Yeah, well, thank you. Sure. It's been a blast, and we'll do it again sometime.
All right, perfect. That's it. That's what you hear from Sensei David. Hope you guys all have a good day. Hope you enjoyed listening. And the next time you hear from us, it'll actually be my birthday episode where we're going to be talking about The Thing, my favorite movie of all time. One of the 2 favorite movies of all time, in my opinion. Stay safe. Be happy, and we'll see you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye.